I'm Richard Ammons, and on behalf of the solid gold class of 1974, I want to welcome you to this morning's discussion of a transformational event in the life of the college. In September 1973, Gerald Penny, a graduate of St. Augustine's High School in New Orleans, arrived on the Amherst College campus to begin his freshman year. The salutatorian of his graduating class, he arrived with his older brother, Alston, and his father to check into his room in James Hall. Neil Sullivan, Andy Gordon, Steve Scroggins, Cullen Murphy, we were all dorm advisors to that freshman class. Mark Hinckley, I think, was a dorm advisor that year. As Gerald was unpacking, his brother Austin turned to me and asked, "What can he expect?" A week later, Gerald drowned in Pratt Pool while taking the college's required swimming test. This was clearly a tragedy for his family, his friends, and the college. This morning, we're going to spend time talking about what happened, its aftermath, and the legacy of this event in the life and history of the college. With me this morning are my classmate, Mark London, from the class of '74, who at the time was an editor and reporter for the Amherst Student. Mark is now a lawyer and author based in D.C. Bob Bellinger, a member of the class of 1977, Gerald Penny's class. Bob is a scholar of African American and American history and an associate professor emeritus at Suffolk University and lives in Boston. Alan Hart, a member of the class of 1982, is a psychologist and the Maxwell Family Professor of Life Sciences in the Psychology Department. He is a former Dean of Students at Amherst and currently serves as a special assistant to the president. We thought we'd organize our time today by describing what happened, what impact it had on the college. We will share a clip from a video about the incident that is in the process, the video's in the process, and then we will reflect on the long-term legacy of Gerald Penny. So I want to start off this morning by asking Mark, as the reporter of record for the Amherst Student, what is your understanding of what happened?
Thank you, Richard. Thanks, everybody, for being here. This happened, as you know, in the first several weeks of our senior year. It was stunning. He drowned on a Wednesday. We had the banner headline on Thursday in the Student. And then we had the long piece the following Monday. I don't know, does everyone have that?
We passed out.
Oh, great. Okay, so yes. I won't. I do want to give a shout out. I know Cullen is here and Jimmy Warren is here. I don't know if Robert Steinberg is here, but there he is. We just had a phenomenal staff back then, and we were all rowing together. And so this piece, which has endured for 50 years, is really a product of everyone. And I'm going to talk a little bit at the end about some other work that these great friends of mine did. At the time, we were all under some impression that we were somewhat supposed to swim. And as it turns out, there was at one point a requirement that you couldn't graduate unless you swam. You had to pass the swimming test. Well, that evaporated at some point, and I keep saying at some point, not because I'm not remembering, there's a lot I don't remember, but no one seemed to have known when the test stopped existing. What came in its place was a requirement that you had to pass the swim test in the first 2 semesters, or you'd get an F in phys ed. And Gerald Penny, in my understanding, and Bob will help me on that, but he didn't want to take the test. And so he sort of ignored it. And then he got a notice in his mailbox that you'll see in the article that said basically if you don't take the test, you're going to get a failure in phys ed. So the difference between you're not going to graduate and you're going to get a failure for the semester in phys ed to an incoming freshman, it was a distinction without a difference. He was scared, and he did it. And he went into the pool, and one of the eyewitnesses said that he had seen Gerald at the bottom of the pool for at least 2 laps that he had swum. It's really tough for Robert Lockwood, who was the lifeguard on duty. It was very tough for him because he did not have a point of view of where Gerald died. He couldn't see him at the desk where he was sitting. When someone pointed out that he was under the water, they quickly brought him out. Leo Marks was one of the folks who was at the pool at the time. Leo had been in the Navy, so he really did know CPR, but he was already dead when they pulled him out of the water. As a lawyer, I look back and I say, you know, the school had a lot of exposure for what it did. Number one, it forced him to do this test, but to me, more importantly, it's a test, and therefore some people have to be looking at the pool because that means he may not pass the test. Well, nobody was looking at the pool. Again, as a lawyer, it's not admissible, the curative steps that were taken. After that, they did have 2 lifeguards, but it was too late. Bob is going to talk about what a remarkable person he was, and I mean, the testament is we're 50 years later. He had been here less than a week, and he's probably the most consequential student in the last 50 years at Amherst College, which is a legacy to him, and I think a legacy to the institution, too, recognizing what we had done and what he had done in his life. By the way, the Drinkwater, David Drinkwater wrote a report that came out about 5 weeks later, basically just saying everything we said in the article was true, and the school eventually settled with the Penny family. I have a tear-stained personal letter that I got, and now it's, of course, my phone isn't working, from his dad. And it said, a handwritten letter, thanks Mark and Andy for sending me a copy of the Amherst Student paper. Your article was very encouraging to us, and thanks for the fine effort of the students in trying to get the facts of the Penny tragedy. We have so much demands to see the article, especially from high school and college students here, that I'm asking you and your staff, if possible, to send me 10 copies or as many as you can. Please inform me of the price, and I'll immediately send you a check to cover the expense of shipping and the cost of the copies. Wishing you and your staff luck and success during your stay at Amherst College. I mean, this was just a wonderful, sweet man, and you know, it was tear-stained when it was written, and it was tear-stained when I read it. In the immediate aftermath, and Alan and Bob are way too young to know this because they're not in the class of the 50th reunion, there was a remarkable back and forth that happened between Dean Richard O'Daniels, who was an assistant dean of students, and Bill Ward. Dean O'Daniels, an African-American, had been terminated shortly after the Penny incident. President Ward said that he had made the decision much earlier on. It had nothing to do with, obviously, the Penny tragedy, but he had held the decision until later. And then it started a back and forth between the two of them, and this is what I talked about before about the student. The Amherst Student ran this debate in its papers, and it was just a remarkably mature and important debate, which today I'm sure, you know, President Ward would have accused Dean O'Daniels' father of assassinating Kennedy, and Dean O'Daniels would have said, oh, you're a president, wee Willie Ward. But back then, people actually went back and forth on issues. And President Ward said, this is how he characterized the Daniel's essay. He said there were three major elements: the concept of institutional racism, which, of course, why should we be taking a test here at Amherst College to swim? And, you know, there was a disproportionate number of African-American students who didn't pass the test. The second was the relation of a dean who was black with the college, and the third is the necessity for change. I'm not going to get into the debate right now, but I will point out that the necessity for change is something that came about in a most positive way in the aftermath of this horrible incident. I personally believe that, for example, the decision that Ward made about coeducation became easier when he realized that the old ways, the swimming test and those requirements, were dumb. And so change, in many positive ways, I think, came as a bystander to the Penny tragedy. And then let me finish by talking about the last communication back and forth was from O'Daniel to Ward. And then I'm going to pass it over. Bob, you're next, right? And so he writes at the end, he says, let us conclude, these are long pieces back and forth, but, you know, everybody who cared read them and really absorbed them and understood the importance of this discussion. Let us conclude by acknowledging once and for all that just because we suddenly decide that change would be beneficial, we must not think that such change can come about instantaneously. Let us further understand that we cannot merely ignore our past misdoings nor dwell upon them so long as to rationalize further wrong. And lastly, let us especially understand that we cannot undergo change and remain the same. These things are being said because this is the challenge which confronts Amherst College. Regardless of the players, whether it be me as an assistant dean or John William Ward as president, the game shall remain the same. And let not our sense of enormity in grieving the tragic death of Gerald Penny prevent us from examining and re-examining the full implications of what has occurred. Let us not concern ourselves with the small issue of my status here, for this is a question I shall fully pursue with the administration. Rather, let us remember September as an end to our complicity in institutional insensitivity. I mean, it was a remarkable back and forth, and I think it was one of the beginning moments of a legacy of Gerald Penny, which has endured and has matured in many positive ways for this college. Over to you, Bob.
Thanks. Thanks, Mark. Bob, you arrived at Amherst at the same time as Gerald Penny. What does this mean to you and to your classmates as you began your tenure here at Amherst?
Well, we began, and I described freshman year as a roller coaster ride, right, with highs and lows. And my class was a very particular class. At the time, we had the largest number of black students in one class. I think there were 36 of us or so. And so that was particular. And there were a group of about a dozen of us who bonded and became fast friends. And Gerald was one of those. And so we were on this roller coaster ride together, but we never could have anticipated the depth of the dip that happened with his drowning. But we never really talked a lot about this test, although we all knew that it was there. The day of his drowning, we were in a class together. It was he and I and Alan Blackwell were in Philosophy 11, a class that we found to be troubling because it debated things that really seemed disconnected from the world we were living in here at Amherst College. And so we often would have lunch and talk about the class. That particular day, Gerald and I and Alan left class, had lunch together, and then parted ways. It was later that day that I heard of what happened to Gerald. We were all hit by this. It impacted us greatly. I don't really even have the words for it, but I think that the impact has continued over the 50 years. One thing I have noticed in coming back to the college for reunions, for Black alumni reunions, is that there has been very few members of my class who make it back to this college on the Hill. I think that it is related to that being the part of our beginning here at Amherst College. Last November when I was here and we did the memorial for Gerald Penny, my classmate Lamar Albritton made a comment about the larger issues. Lamar was from Arkansas, small town, and he talked about what it was like as a black student coming from a southern black community going to a place like Amherst College, and how everyone in your community, your church community, your school community, knew that you were going off to this college and that you were destined for greatness. And they celebrated you because you represented them. You know, I knew that I represented my community and my family as well. And so when this tragedy struck, it did not just strike his family. It struck his whole community. And it also reverberated in communities of all of us who were part of that freshman class. So this is something that has to be recognized. This is something that the pieces are still being put back together. And I do remember that exchange that was in the newspapers. I read them all. And one of the things that Dean O'Daniel said became a guiding line for me in my career as an educator. He said something to the effect of, to be a black administrator at a predominantly white institution is by definition to be in opposition to that institution. And I understood what that meant. It meant that often, if you were the one who was upholding the best of students who looked like you, that you were often in challenge to an institution that was trying to figure out how to make a space for people who look like you. And that didn't end 50 years ago. It continues to this day, not only here, but at institutions all across this country, as we see. But Gerald's memory was something that we in his class felt was very, very, very important. And that is why we had the Black Cultural Center named in his honor, the Gerald Penny Memorial Black Cultural Center. And it is an important part of this campus. And I don't know how many of you have ever ventured in or spent time there, but on the wall there is a portrait of Gerald, done from his freshman Facebook picture when Facebook was, not online, right? When we actually had them, and I still have my freshman Facebook. But there's also a plaque in memorial to him, and I want to read what the plaque says, since I see it's under construction and you may not be able to get in. It says, "He was fiercely proud and extremely dedicated to his race and to the betterment of racial relations. He had always displayed the keenest interest in his identity and in the essential human values, universality and dignity of all mankind. He walked proud as a black American, and this testimonial, while in his name, is truly a tribute to all young men and women who have strived and who will always continue to strive so valiantly towards the fulfillment of a sincere life, with the interior and exterior peace inherent therein. Since our son, Gerald Gilbert Anthony Penny, cannot be restored to us, it is comforting that his memory will be cherished by those who so briefly knew him and by those many fine students who will attend Amherst in the years ahead. Austin E. Penny, Sr. And when I started my comments the first time I spoke about Gerald Penny, I said, how is it possible to speak of someone who you knew for such a short time, but has been part of the majority of your life? And so I remember Gerald. I remember his joy of living. I remember his happiness with meeting new people. I remember him saying, my name is Penny, but I'm worth more than that. And I also remember the way that he was memorialized by the wonderful scholar and poet, Professor Sonia Sanchez, who wrote a poem for him. And, as the line says, and to live to be 17 is good in the sight of God. Thank you.
Thanks, Bob. As part of the ongoing conversation about race and Amherst College, a group of 5 alumni are developing a video to examine a variety of issues around our history. And some piece of that talks about Gerald Penny and his death. Alan, I'll turn to you. From your vantage point as Dean of Students and Professor, what are the issues raised by this incident for the college as it has sought to make the college a place where a broad diversity of students can thrive?
Thank you, Richard, and thank you all for being here this morning. I'm Alan Hart. I'm currently the Special Assistant to President Elliott and a professor in the Psychology Department. Let me just go a little bit off script just to say that class of '82, when I arrived in 1978, the center had been dedicated, and the first gathering, there was an early black student orientation that I attended in the fall, September of 1978, that was held in the Octagon. I grew up in a predominantly white town in western Massachusetts, Williamstown, where Williams College is. And for me, I remember to this day that gathering in the Octagon, although there were probably only about 25 black students who were part of that class of 1982, a number of upper-class students came back as well. And for me, it was the largest gathering of black faces that I had been a part of that wasn't a family reunion to that point in my life. And that sort of still sticks with me 45, 46 years later. But I want to talk a little bit about the legacy of Gerald and what the college is doing to commemorate, memorialize, highlight, and make the history more public, not only about Gerald, but about the college's history more generally, and to tell a more complete, inclusive narrative of the Amherst College history. And I think we've been using with this film and other activities on campus to use this tragic story as almost a model to imagine how we might tell other untold stories as part of telling that more complete history of Amherst College. The sizzle reel that you just saw, a 3-minute little snippet, was created by Nichelle Carr from the class of 1989 in collaboration with a number of alums and the college administration. And we thought it was really important to capture these first-person voices of Gerald's story. The video contains snippets that came from 2 commemorative events that were put on this fall that commemorated marked the 50th anniversary of Gerald's death. Both events were designed to lean into the pain and sorrow, but also celebrate the joy and legacy by showing Gerald as a 3-dimensional figure, not simply a tragic caricature. On September 12th, the day that he drowned, we held a ceremony of remembrance in Chapin Chapel honoring Gerald. On November 12th, during Homecoming Black Alumni Weekend, we held a commemoration of Gerald's Amherst life, including a ringing of Stern's steeple bells. Copies of that program are in the back of the room, and I don't know if you wouldn't mind circulating those, or maybe we can pass those around. That also includes a copy of the poem that Bob referenced that Sonia Sanchez wrote in Gerald's honor. That's part of the program that is being circulated right now. As part of Gerald's legacy, I would say it was rooted initially starting in February 1974 when the Penny Center was named in his honor, the first floor of the Octagon. This came about as a student-driven movement under the leadership and insistence, and I think demands and activism were part of that activity as well, of students, largely driven by students, some of whom are in this room right now. Bob said more about the Cultural Center, so I will skip it a little bit in my own notes. But some of the images that flashed on the screen were from the Octagon. But I also want to say that in the past, other commemorative activities have ended up being standalone, kind of one-off events with limited ongoing impact. The college has made a concerted effort to ensure that Gerald's case is different. As part of the college's reckoning with our racial history, one of President Elliott's priorities, we are modeling and reinforcing Amherst's commitment to sustain a healthy and supportive campus community that celebrates diversity and drives student success inside and outside of the classroom. There's another pamphlet in the back of the room describing some of this activity. It's called The Reckoning with the Racial History of Amherst College. Let me just mention two of the core principles that are guiding that work. One is that we will work to research and understand our own history, to be transparent, truthful, and accountable for our history, and to learn from it. A second principle is we will tell the stories of individuals, groups, and places that are part of the college history that have not been historically represented in the college's spaces and structures. Gerald's story is one example of a story not well enough known that we are working to ensure is more widely shared and shapes institutional practices and assumptions. But we're also ensuring that the telling of Gerald's story also serves as a model for how to make our history more public and to provide a more nuanced, textured, and complete history of Amherst College. In fact, I just re-met Matthew, who's in the room from the class of 1974, class of 1914. He's much younger than the 74s in the room. And confessing that he didn't know about Gerald Penny's story, even though he graduated just 10 years ago. And there is something about this story that is sort of both known and not known. There's sort of, to borrow a phrase, kind of that double consciousness of a story that's known well and felt by a lot of people, but also invisible to lots of other people as well. But as we think of telling a more complete history of the college, we want our stories to be impactful, meaningful, with staying power. And that really requires several things that we have tried to prioritize. It involves relationship building, student involvement, curricular innovation, interdisciplinary approaches, and collaboration. I would say, related to Gerald's work and the Racial Reckoning Committee that's doing some of this work, we've done a lot of initiatives in these different areas. Let me just mention two that kind of relate particularly to Gerald's story. One to Gerald's story and one that's sort of tangentially related. One of the things that we're doing in terms of reckoning and trying to build sustainability into our history is that actually with Richard's support, we've reestablished connection with St. Augustine High School in New Orleans, which was Gerald's alma mater. A very highly regarded school for which students have applied over the years, but there's really been a gap. After Gerald's death, there was a fracture in the relationship between Amherst College and St. Augustine High School. We are working to rebuild that relationship, and recently we've had a student apply from St. Augustine to Amherst, who didn't come to Amherst, who went to an Ivy League school instead. But that's one example of a relationship that we're trying to repair, rebuild, and make sustainable into the future. Another thing that we're doing, and then my last handout that's in the back of the room, is in terms of telling not only the college's history, but how it dovetails with the history of the town of Amherst. And in the back of the room highlights an exhibit that's right now in Frost Library. If you go into Frost up on the landing, on the second floor landing, there's an exhibit called Ancestral Bridges, which is doing a lot of familial research around a Black indigenous family and communities in Amherst and their long-standing relationship with Amherst College. fact, the family predates Amherst College, which, as you know, was started in 1821, but a lot of the local folks think that Amherst, the town of Amherst, didn't have black people in it until, Amherst College or until the university started. But there's a long, rich tradition of black and indigenous families in this area that are also highlighted as part of telling a more complete history of not only Amherst College, but also the region. And to me, it strikes me that the land and the place is also a special part of what makes Amherst special. And so I think that's also an important part of the story that we're trying to tell. Let me close with the following. This approach marks a culture shift in how we as a campus study, engage with, and represent our public history. We are modeling a reparative process built upon the core values of our educational mission. Our commitment to a restorative frame underscores our belief that historical wrongs and racial disparities have left lasting inequities at the college and pose impediments to building a more inclusive, thriving, and just campus. In a community dedicated to learning, introducing complexity and nuance, pursuing the full truth of our past should be rewarding and meaningful for everyone. Gerald's legacy demands nothing less. Thank you.
Thanks, Alan. Before opening up to questions and comments from the audience, I want to take a sort of point of personal privilege. Over here, over my right, there's a picture of Charles Hamilton Houston, who in many ways is a personal hero of mine. He graduated in the class of 1915. And in a biography that was written about him, it mentioned that he could not live in the dorms in Amherst. He had to find an apartment in town in which to live. But the biographer said he didn't mind that as much as long as the college enabled him to be the best that he could be intellectually. And the best that he could be intellectually was to be the valedictorian of that class. Charles Hamilton Houston, as many of you know, went on to get a law degree from Harvard and to be the real architect of the NAACP's drive to beat back Jim Crow segregation and founded the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. And so that's part of the legacy that attracted me personally to this place. I also want to give a shout out, as I've done before, to Larry Wissau, because he taught me how to swim here. So let me open it to questions and comments from the audience. I'm sorry.
How does an institution, once it realizes that it's been blind to something like institutional racism, become more proactive and not reactive? I'm sure any institution is blind to certain practices that are disadvantaging communities or hurtful. And so how can they change in a way to be proactive and find them?
I'll look at Bob or Alan.
Thank you for the question. I'll start and feel free to jump in. So I've been here now almost 30 years, and I'm a professor, but I've spent most of my time also in the administration. And partly it's that self-reflection, I think, that helps us evolve and change. I think that one of the things that comes from examining our history and stories like Gerald's is I try to identify the assumptions that we used to make about students, that we make about each other. And then try to really be very nimble about adjusting those assumptions and changing our practices to try to keep up. And it also feels like it is a little bit of a chasing. We're always behind. It feels like we're always behind the curve. And it's sort of a DEI question. Diversity at Amherst can change quickly, and you look at how rapidly the profile of the student body at Amherst College has changed. Because we graduate at such a high rate, every 4 years there really is a complete new student body. And so if you think about a 4 or 6 year window, the complexion, if you will, of the student body can change relatively rapidly. But all the implications and ramifications and structures that also need to correspondingly change, all change at a much slower rate. And so I think it's partly an appetite and the values to sort of say, well, we have to study ourselves, we have to adjust, we have to learn from the students, make students part of the process. I would say in terms of student activism, I can't quantify it. Many of the important changes that have happened at Amherst College were the result of student activism and student voices. So I think we have to include those voices as part of that process as well. But I see it as a process that you have to have an appetite for, resources to really be able to go after it, and then try to create best practices based on what others are doing and trying, but also to try to be leaders in that and not just followers.
It sounds like the Amherst Student was sort of a counterweight maybe to the administration at times, so maybe empowering another group that might be adversarial or at least independent.
No, I think absolutely. Voices, and certainly student voices are critical, often critical with a capital C and sometimes with a little c, but I think a really important part of that process. But yeah, no, absolutely, the different perspectives. The other thing I would say is mentioning about coeducation. I wasn't here at the time of coeducation, but as a student shortly thereafter. And I can imagine voices that said, don't worry, we will admit women, but nothing else will change. Right? Absolutely. Don't worry, nothing else will change. And what we've learned over those last 58 years now, is that everything has to change. And that's the real challenge, is how to sort of keep us as Amherst College, but also know that everything needs to change. So that's kind of the dynamic that we have to wrestle with. Thank you.
I know that Bob had a question.
Another way to first address your question, to be proactive, is to actively engage in telling the full history of the college and those who attended. Richard pointed out Charles Hamilton Houston, and earlier as we were talking, he was going to also point out William Hastie on the left, who was a cousin of Houston and who also went from here to Harvard Law and was part of that group that created the NAACP Legal Defense Fund and were teachers of Thurgood Marshall. And one of the little-known facts is that the first case that they brought in 1930, I think it was 35, was Donald Gaines Murray, who was Amherst class of 34 and was suing the University of Maryland. So Amherst is very much a part of this national change as well. And I think that while we recognize that it was in my freshman year that we decided to rename the Cultural Center after Gerald Penny, it was in my senior year that we renamed one of the houses, which had been the Phi Alpha Psi House, after Charles Drew. And that was a student-driven effort. And one of the things that disturbed me was seeing a publication that rolled it into the renaming of all the frat houses, and it was not. It preceded that. It was a student effort because we realized there was nothing on this campus to commemorate Charles Drew, who had come here and had a stellar medical career inventing blood plasma and many other things. It was found the next year that there were a collection of Charles Drew houses across the nation, but this was the only one at an undergraduate institution. They were all at medical schools, right? So student work has been very, very important in that. And one last thing that I will say that I meant to say earlier was that after Gerald Penny's death, it was 10 months before I went to the Pratt Pool. And that was in the summer of '75. I was here working in the Springfield Amherst Summer Academy, which was an accredited summer school for young African-American students from Springfield. And they had a pool party, and I went down to the pool party. I was there for maybe 10, 15 minutes tops. I left. Never been back in Pratt Pool, right? That's one of the impacts it had on me.
Mark Carroll?
With all of the changes that have occurred and the discussion about diversity, equity, and inclusion across the country, how do you see that impacting the efforts at Amherst to improve racial integration and interaction on campus?
I'm happy to take that one as well. Part of the Amherst brand, small, intimate campus classrooms, and that has to be, COVID disrupted that, but that has to be the niche that we occupy. And I think, again, that's another kind of ongoing, ongoing work in progress. It's also important that I think we realize that there's learning that happens in the classroom, and students spend most of their time outside of the classroom, on the playing fields in Buckley and elsewhere, and trying to find ways to really engage with each other. The campus has never been more diverse than it is now, but how do we make that diversity translate into real substantive interactions across some of those apparent differences? Some of the things we are doing involve curricular innovation. The way we teach, how we teach, the content of what we teach has shifted. And so in terms of the classroom, I think there are a number of different initiatives, including one of the courses that I co-taught this last semester that I've done now 4 or 5 times, called Intergroup Dialogue, which the nature of the course is really built upon the dynamic in the room. There's a reading list and syllabus and a curriculum. It looks like it's a course. But the meat of the course is much more about how people are interacting with each other in the classroom. And it's a purposefully diverse group. We try to recruit students across different encampments on campus, addressing student-athlete concerns, student-athlete divides that occur on lots of different campuses, international students, race, ethnicity, first generation. We try to recruit a diverse range of students who then engage with each other across those differences on important topics. So curricularly, we try to do that. But also within the programming, there's been shifts in the student affairs division to look more at sort of residential education broadly defined and not just how to have fun in the dorms. And so there really is a purposeful engagement that's trying to address exactly those kinds of issues to increase the likelihood that students in particular really do interact across and learn from each other across these differences.
Once the students are here, but do you anticipate it being more difficult to create that diverse environment on campus moving forward because of what's going on across the country?
No, absolutely. We don't, and so in terms of the admissions process and sort of the post-affirmative action landscape, I'm not in that field. So what I'm going to say is a little bit more speculative. But it's my understanding that the incoming class, whatever class of 2028 or 9 or whatever that's going to be, has been admitted. But it's my understanding that we don't know the profile of that group. For the first time in our history, admissions has often been very proactively involved in trying to put together a class with a very specific profile. Because we're a small community, but we still have a full complement of academic interests and athletic abilities and musical tastes and geographical diversity, all these sorts of things that has made Amherst so strong. But we have not been able to look at the racial ethnic makeup of the class. And I'm not sure when they can actually start to unpack that process, but we haven't been able to do it yet. But I think the worry is that the incoming class is going to look very different than the classes of the last 10 or 12 years. The one thing I would say is that the college is still committed to the values and the mission that got us here where we are today. And so we have to figure out how best to maintain those values in that changing landscape. So yeah, I think the admissions folks, the administration is very worried about how to do that. Yes, please. There's a microphone coming.
I really want to thank you for this important discussion. And I was trying to figure out what made me come, since I'm an old fogey from the class of '64. But I wondered if we could take a look a little bit at the context for what happened. I was thinking in terms of the notion of initiation rites. This is a community, or it's several communities. And when new people come, especially from cultures that have not typically been accepted here, there are initiation rites that are built into the structure of the campus. So for a black person from the South, the initiation rite was you gotta prove that you can swim. As part of being an Amherst man. And there is clearly a racial undertone to that, which I suspect was largely unconscious at the time. And so the question is how you deal with these unconsciously determined structures that exist across the campus. When I came in 1964, it wasn't black students who were the question. I think I'm here because of a painful memory I have of that freshman week when the athletic directors had us go through trials. I don't remember the swim test. I remember we had to run around the gym, and one of the coaches was observing, and I remember being told in a very shaming way that my posture was bad and that an Amherst man ought to have better posture. I don't know where that came from. I know what my experience of it is. It's why I'm here today, listening to your presentation, because I experienced it as a shaming, humiliating description of why I was an outsider on the campus. At the time, there were a lot of Jewish students who were beginning to come to college, elite campuses from the cities on the East Coast. I was one of them. And I experienced that as a comment. This is, my own mythology at work, but as a comment that you guys are outsiders and you're not really one of the Deerfield crowd. So this discussion is an opportunity to look at how, I think, unconsciously we structure admission rules. When I came, the fraternities had hazing, basically, and people chose the fraternities on the basis of which group they felt most comfortable with. A group of us, largely city kids who didn't feel comfortable joining the fraternity hazing environment, signed up at Phi Psi. Our entry was to find our own separate, somewhat rebellious way of being a member of the community. So part of the discussion, I hope, is to have an introspective look at the way we set up initiation rites. What does it take to be, what is an Amherst man anyway? And what does it take to be a part of that community?
Thank you.
Good.
Me again?
You're
No, I'm happy. No,
the subject matter expert here.
No, wonderful. No, thank you for the question. One of the things I also want to point out, so in the back of the room, if this has made its way around, it's a postcard, you can't possibly read it, called Reckoning with the Racial History of Amherst College. And there's a stack in the back of the room that also has a QR code, the little funny squiggly thing that you take a picture of, and will take you to a website that describes some of the work that the college is doing related to all these things that we're talking about, including programming about Gerald Penny, but also some of these broader issues as well. And particularly looking at the racial history. You said a lot of things that I could comment about. Let me just say one thing really quickly about some of the racial history of Amherst College that we're looking at really actually has to do with this measurement of at the time it was men. And what does the Amherst man as a model look like? And it actually involved, it's sort of now, we would use the phrase scientific racism, that looking at things like phrenology, your skull's shape and size, your posture, and then making inferences about your potential as a human being based on this really kind of scientific mismeasurement of human beings. It really was all designed to justify the status quo. So, right, it's designed to say this is why this group is inferior to another group. And so that's why, I hope you went on to become a marathon runner or something just to prove them wrong. But so part of it was that process. So we're actually also looking at Amherst's involvement in that kind of ideology in terms of, again, reckoning with our racial history, because a lot of it was designed to provide, data supporting the status quo. So that's one of the first things I would say. Initiation. We do have, imagine though we're bringing people from around the world to this little small place, many for whom this is the end of the earth, right? It feels like it's not Williamstown, it's not Middlebury, but it's pretty close to the end of the earth. As well as folks, English isn't their first language, so you imagine the interesting diversity that we have here. How do you initiate people into the Amherst way? We have orientation, and we try to acclimate people to certain kinds of things as best we can, but they always describe it as trying to drink out of a fire hose. How do you help people make that transition? Let alone thinking about the academic leap that so many of us had to make to survive here as well. Even if we did go to a boarding school, which I did. I didn't go to Deerfield, I went to Exeter. But the same thing. But I was a first-generation poor kid who found Exeter and then Amherst and still was drinking out of a fire hose. And so that's part of the challenge of how do you get people to thrive in this kind of environment. Not only just the culture shock, but then the rules and regulations and all the other sorts of things as well, and the freedoms. So it really is a challenge.
I guess I'll be brief. I'm not in a reunion class, being from the class 77, but Richard invited me to the class of 74 dinner last night, and I had a chance to meet some of his classmates. And just in going through the tent, I realized what a diverse group of people there were there, right? In terms of interests, occupations, everything about the group. It was a very diverse group. So the diversity is there, even though they were all Amherst men, because it's pre-co-ed, right? So there are many ways to be an Amherst man or woman. And I think by telling the stories of those who come here, we get a better sense of what that means. And we also enlarge the idea of what it means to belong here. And there are many initiations that take place, and sometimes they need to be challenged. And I had a lot of friends who were pre-med, and one of the initiations was organic chemistry, which was, very tough, and you'd see people sweating. And there were a group of friends of mine who, after the first semester, said, "This isn't working." And they, en masse, went over to Mount Holyoke and took the second semester. Even though the myth was, if you did not do it here, you would not get into med school. They took it there. They were happier than they had been first semester. Their grades were better, and all of those who applied to medical school got in, right? So sometimes you have to challenge the structures that are set up to say, you have to do this to be here, right? And so we have to stand on our own, stand with each other, and recognize that the human variety is what really the Amherst experience should be about.
Richard, could I say something?
Yes. Last comment.
Which is, unfortunately, to bring it back to Gerald Penny, we had to go through that tragedy to begin to understand that initiations that we used to have were dumb. I wish Kim Townsend were here because he wrote this wonderful biography of Bill Ward, and I'd like to hear him talk about the impact. I said to Richard earlier this week, I said, could you imagine Bill Ward having to make the phone call to Gerald Penny's father? And Richard pointed out it was Nat Reed who actually made the phone call. But in his mind, this kid who had the future in front of him is now dead. And what did we do in this school to contribute to that? And whatever it is that we find, we have to address. And I think we were very fortunate to be able to have that O'Daniel Ward discussion because, we were a counterweight at the student on a lot of issues. But this issue was really heavy, and it would have been tough for us to tackle it. Unfortunately, O'Daniel did tackle it. and it was tackled in a way, it wasn't a cause anymore. It was somebody's life had been snuffed out. And so we really need to take it seriously, and we need to make change. And we have made change, and we'll continue to make change. Over to you, Richard.
Thanks, Mark. We're at our time, unfortunately. And I want to thank Bob, Mark, and Alan, and all of you for being a part of this discussion. A number of people who probably will have things to ask us outside, because I think there's another group coming in here now. But thank you all for being here, part of it.